Today's developments in the legislature have made it clear that this government's priorities when it comes to legislation are not students or parents, but rather themselves. The Minister of Education should not be here today introducing legislation to bully and force essential education workers back to work. In fact, he's introducing legislation to force them back to work before they have even entered a strike. Where the education minister should be is at the negotiating table, working to reach an equitable deal that is negotiated at the table that will ensure our kids are safe and in school where they want to be. And it is critical that any deal values our education workers and is fair to them. At a time when this government has reported a $2.1 billion surplus, they are reducing education spending and systematically cutting funding out of our system. The fact is, education workers have kept our schools safe during the global pandemic, and it is at significant risk to their health and the well-being of themselves and their families that they did this. They have had no real wage increase in quite some time and are now facing record inflation and a possible recession. So it is important to be clear that the workers the education minister is bullying back to work with this preemptive legislation are some of the lowest paid education workers in Ontario's system. Today, this minister is saying through his legislation that these heroes of our education system are not valued. He is saying to these workers that their government are worth more than these workers are being treated, and they are not able to put food on the table and to feed their families without taking 2 and 3 jobs. The federal Liberal government put people first during the pandemic and in fact gave the Ontario government funding to help our education system. They were there for Canadians and willing to do whatever it took to look after people and to get through this once in a lifetime event. Here in Ontario, the Ford government hoarded the money. They're socking it away in contingency funds. They are padding their books. The FAO has cited over the next few years, it's going to be $6 billion that will be taken out of education. And at the end of the day, this government is clearly saying that they are not here to help people who need it the most. And they are certainly not here to help our education workers. In fact, what they are doing today with this legislation is creating far more chaos and uncertainty for parents and for students. Thank you. I will now take your questions.
Given the two sides were so far apart and so entrenched, what else could the government have done? I mean, the Liberal government a decade ago also imposed contracts on teachers.
The Liberal government never introduced preemptive legislation. It was only after there was a prolonged and protracted labor disruption that back-to-work legislation was introduced, when it would put at risk the students being able to complete their term. That's not the case in this instance. This minister, from the very beginning, threatened to use legislation as a bullying tactic during these negotiations. And frankly, he has poisoned the negotiating environment. We see where not only is CUPE declaring that as soon as they are legally able to strike that they will, it's also other education labor unions have withdrawn their bargaining days. So we are spiraling into chaos in our education system. And this was solely created by Minister Lecce and Premier Ford in their poor treatment of these education workers, despite the fact that they have a strong mandate from their own members to withdraw service.
Do the Liberals support the plan of the union to go on protest?
Well, listen, another egregious act of this legislation is the use of the notwithstanding clause. That diminishes our Constitution and the democracy for all Canadians. And, this government cannot negotiate and close off on a collective agreement with one labor union without resorting to the use of the notwithstanding clause. So, workers, to express their dissatisfaction with what is happening at the bargaining table, took to protesting and demonstrating. And I could just imagine that maybe we're in for more of that because of the disrespect that Minister Lecce and Premier Ford has shown with the introduction of this legislation, that they don't value education workers, that they don't respect the bargaining process. And they won't even show up to the bargaining table. There's still 3 days left that they can negotiate a deal. Why are they not at the table instead of introducing this very presumptive and draconian form of legislation that uses the notwithstanding clause to get what they want?
Mitzie, are you concerned this could be precedent setting? And I say this not disrespectfully, but you've got education workers work very hard and they're getting paid very little, but yet this hammer is being dropped on them. Is that a concern for you and your party with regards to what could happen in the future with those who may be deemed even more important than education workers, where they can just drop that hammer and say, you guys are all going back?
It absolutely is a slippery slope. Using such a very aggressive way to treat workers who are within their bargaining rights of collective bargaining. They're doing step bargaining. They've followed every legal step required of them. And what is required of the government is to stick with the negotiations at the table until you hammer out a deal. Today they're introducing an order in council to bring the legislature back at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning to debate the legislation. Well, why don't you stay at the bargaining table round the clock until you get a deal? Oftentimes, it is at those final hours of hard bargaining that a deal is done. That's what should be done. And yet this government is diminishing the bargaining process by resorting to the use of legislation, by resorting to the use of the notwithstanding clause, which was not contemplated for the everyday use of provincial governments. It was supposed to be an exceptional clause that was used in very unique circumstances. This is not a unique circumstance. This is progressive bargaining. And this government doesn't have the courage or the confidence to complete the bargaining process without introducing this legislation. I believe that it is wrong, and I believe that it is taking away the bargaining rights and the bargaining abilities of some of our workers who are the most valued in our school system, that school secretary, that EA that works with those special need students, those early childhood educators. We know that there's been so much learning loss at the younger years in terms of our kindergarten students having social and emotional development. They need the attention of those ECEs right now to help them to catch up. And instead of investing in our public education system, Minister Lecce and Premier Ford are taking resources out of the education system. $1.8 billion they are cutting from education and saying that they cannot afford to pay these lowest paid workers more, giving them lowball offers, disrespecting them in the use of this draconian legislation. It is wrong.
Mitzie, what other unions have withdrawn their bargaining dates, like you mentioned a few minutes ago?
Yeah, from my information that I've received, I'm the education critic for the Ontario Liberal Party and former Minister of Education. And from what I'm hearing from the sector is that they are not happy with today's legislation. Not only is it disrespectful to the bargaining process that CUPE was undertaking, it also really does not bode well for the other education unions as well, who were preparing their bargaining dates. And so, I believe that everyone is now reconsidering how much they can trust this government to do free and fair bargaining. And I believe that today trust was broken with the introduction of this legislation.
During question period, Minister Lecce sort of mentioned that whatever the education workers get, it ends up sort of being the base level minimum for what the other education unions want. As someone with some experience in this area, can you tell us how true that is?
That is a very complicated question, but I will attempt to give a response, because it really all depends on the parameters and the scope of negotiation that the unions propose and that the government accepts. So as a practice within the education sector, there is what is known as a Me Too part of the agreement, that they can settle an agreement at the negotiating table, but if there are other points that are negotiated with education workers at another stage of negotiations, that they will have the opportunity to also receive that point as well. So if it's based on salaries or some other benefit, that they don't have to worry about closing off their agreement and missing out on some aspect, because they can address it later on with that specific Me Too clause.
So it's a legitimate concern here that if they give these education workers the increase they want, then it'll just spiral into more spending for other types of education employees.
Well, someone has to go first in terms of the bargaining process, and so it really just allows the process to happen by not being worried of who goes first. You just go first, you complete your negotiations, and the next unions will do their negotiations, and then you can relook at any aspect of the deal that does apply to your members. You'll have an opportunity to do that.
Mitzie, how does the government settle on what the fines are going to be? We're seeing $4,000 per individual, $500,000 for the union. I was looking at Bill 115 from 2012. I know I weren't minister then, but there's nothing mentioned about the fines there. So can you kind of just walk us through how the fine amounts are decided upon?
The final amounts?
The amount that an individual or a union would be fined if they were in contravention of legislation, like how do they decide what that's going to be?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I'm only now just reading the legislation that was just tabled. It is obviously written from the government's point of view, but the government is not the final arbiter of the law. That we have, under our constitutional democracy, we have a judiciary that it will have an opportunity to hear from these unions if they choose to take this to the courts, and that's definitely at risk when you look at this legislation. Even though they've evoked the notwithstanding clause to try to avoid that sort of litigation, but the labor unions will still have the opportunity to take this forward and to to express their concern that their rights are being denied for free and fair collective bargaining. In terms of the awards that are given through the courts for any breach, that is it's really up to the judge to decide what that is. In the case of the remedy that was put forward for Bill 115, the justice actually had the unions and the government work out the remedy together, and had to sit down and figure out what the value was of the loss of the opportunity to negotiate a fair settlement, which is why, as Interim Leader John Fraser said, this government should, take the opportunity, do the hard work now of negotiating a deal with the labor unions, because at the end of the day, you're just going to cost time and money if it has to go through the courts. Thank you very much, everyone.